What we do when we get into the wiring of most of the motors, if we can make it more like simple on our end, we'll mark things so that we can put them back in the same spot. And you can see that Miguel marked these posts in marker, and then the wires that go on them get the same mark. Very similar to like marking the stator versus the chassis so that you can put it back in the same spot. So you're always thinking ahead of how you're going to reassemble it once you're disassembling it. So typically what we find on a stationary switch failure is when you pull the levers up in the handle to start the unit, you'll hear it hum and it won't rotate. Some guys will give it a little kickstart, get it going, and essentially what you're doing is changing positions so that this thing gets released so that the buffer will start. So this is a switch like on off. This is the same concept. We find that these contacts in here will burn or get debris on them. A lot of times you'll find if you blow out the top of your motor, because this is an open motor, it's not a sealed case, you'll be able to blow out the debris and get the unit to start. But if you find you have to do that a lot, normally you'll have to replace this stationary switch. If it's not the stationary switch and it's not starting, then we'll go to capacitors and or handle switches. But for right now, we'll check the capacitors and then go over the stationary switch replacement, and Miguel will show us that.
Okay, so every time we gonna check capacitor, before touch it, we gotta discharge with the resistor.
Yeah, and all we're doing, capacitor is going to store energy, and all we're doing is taking it out. You will get a shock if you touch those. So we just discharge it so that we can work on them and test them. So
61.
He's testing the run capacitor. It's 60 microfarads. It's registering at 61. We do a plus or minus, whether or not the capacitor is good or bad. And this is good, so we'll leave it. This is the start capacitor, and it's 460 to 530 microfarads, and we're at 521. So we're right in ballpark there for plus or minus. You definitely want to get the same dimensions and same microfarads of what your capacitor, if you have to replace it, measures. And that's important because you're fitting into retaining cases, caps, those kinds of things, and where it's positioned on the motor. So size does come into play. If it's too big a unit, it won't fit in these and go back very easily. The wiring diagrams for these units, particularly the American Sanders units, we have on our website with the manual. Whenever we're typically repairing equipment, if they're just in general, what we do when we get into the wiring of most of the motors, if we can make it more like simple on our end, we'll mark things so that we can put them back in the same spot. And you can see that Miguel marked these posts in marker, and then the wires that go on them get the same mark. Very similar to like marking the stator versus the chassis so that you can put it back in the same spot. So you're always thinking ahead of how you're going to reassemble it once you're disassembling it. We have this centrifugal switch, and where that gets that phrase or term, when this armature gets up to speed, this switch flies away. It has weights on the bottom, and once it gets to a certain RPM, it flies away. When it flies away, it disengages the switch. But right now, the switch will be engaged or off, and then when it flies away and the switch is open, the motor can run. So if this is a bad switch, if there's material in there, debris, or if it's welded together, all of those things will cause this motor to not start. This stationary switch is only held onto that lid by 2 screws, so it's pretty easy. And then again, same concept, what wires came off of it get marked so that they go back on the same way. Or check or consult the diagram, wiring diagram that's in the manual that would be on our website at cityfloorsupply.com. So what he did there was just feed the wires through from the stator and the ground through the access point here that's typically covered up by this plate. Yep. And this top is marked so that these screws line up through the motor and allow them to bolt it to the chassis. And this is just the cover cap or a dust cap. So that's the essentially replacing a stationary switch and testing the capacitors. So you had access to all the wiring that's in here that goes to both capacitors run and start and to the stationary switch, so that any repairs that you might have, capacitor failure or switch failure, should be able to change that in the field. And this would be a relatively easy repair to happen in the field. So if you had any questions with regard to the common repair on a buffer for the stationary switch, or testing and replacing start and run capacitors on your buffer, if your buffer has them, you can give us a call at 800-737-1786, or go ahead to cityfloorsupply.com. You can get the owner's manual there and look up wiring diagrams as well.